Greetings and welcome to the final episode of the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. Today is a defining moment after goodness knows how many months and how many episodes later. This is the very last episode of the Pandemic Podcast. Whilst the madness of what has gone before us still in many ways continues, there comes a time where one must pivot and turn their attention in order to think about how we can create a better world in the wake of what we've witnessed over the last couple of years. So this episode tonight marks the end of an era. It's a point of transition, and this is my epilogue. I'm going to be sharing tonight in this final episode the potted history of the Pandemic Podcast, where it all began, some of the stories along the way of what we've been able to do and achieve and contribute, some of the craziness that has unfolded before us, and then point to the future about where we seek to go with our new project, the Elevate Podcast, which is launching on Monday. So I've had my critics along the way, and if you thought this is the end of my face on social media, think again. So tonight's conversation, I unfortunately don't know how many episodes we've created. We've had some challenges along the way with some censorship. I'll show you the remnants of our former YouTube channel that was closed down after 5 million views, deplatformed. So keeping an episode count across the various platforms has been quite tricky. We've had episodes removed from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all along the way. So a final episode count is challenging, but we've definitely done over 400 episodes and probably over 500 episodes of the Pandemic Podcast over the course of the last 2 years. And I plan to this evening take you through the journey and then talk to you about where we're going from here. So gather around the Friday afternoon fire on this spring day as I tell the story of the Pandemic Podcast and where it all began and where it's going. I'm going to have a crack at sharing my screen so you can see a little bit about where this all began, my memoirs, if you will. There we go. How it all began, the Pandemic Podcast. Well, we'll go back a little way, back to 2020. Back to 2020, 2 years ago now. In fact, I'll start sharing in a moment because I can tell the story without the slides, and the slides probably won't add to this at this point, but I do have some slides of some memorable moments along the way. But 2020, I entered 2020 with real excitement. There was something magical about seeing the clock tick from 2019 to 2020, because not only did we get a new year that year, we got a new decade. And I thought we'd been through some challenges up until that point, and I thought this is an excellent opportunity to transition into a real decade of change. Now, did I ever imagine what would have unfolded that would create the conditions for what I still believe, and even more so believe, will become the most transformational decade in recent history? It's certainly been an interesting experience, absolutely. So my wife and I got married in November 2019, the back end of 2019, before we entered this new decade. So I was in a new phase of life anyway, a new life event for me. And we booked our honeymoon for early 2020 to go to Thailand for a couple of weeks in the sun. I know what you're thinking, that pale face of yours in the sun. I do all right in the sun, actually. I certainly like spending time in the outdoors in the sun. But we booked our honeymoon for Thailand in the end of February 2020. And as I started to hear stories of this new virus coming out of China, I thought to myself, it will make sense to make sure we're not flying into the eye of the storm, because, of course, as we've discovered through the media over the last 2 years, we've only really heard hysteria. We haven't heard any sense of real assessment of risk. But I'd heard stories and seen imagery. If you remember, cast your mind back to the images that came out of China of people dying in the streets, quite frankly, were bizarre now looking back at it, because of course we didn't see that anywhere else in the world. And it's actually funny enough, later on, I was suspect at the time, having seen those images, but because it was so crazy, you thought, wow, maybe this is something that's really, really deadly. But later on, a friend of mine who's an actor and does stunts, he said that bodies just don't fall like that when people die. They may fall like that if they're acting, but it's highly unlikely that the body would fall in those specific positions if they died of natural causes. Which we look back on and we think, yes, what the heck was going on? How did we fall for that? How did that capture so many people's minds and create that initial wave of fear? But out of due care for my family and thinking about our honeymoon in February 2020, I began paying closer attention to the news and closer attention to some of the science and the data, with no real background in science, but certainly some background experience in numbers and data. Studied economics and econometrics at university, advanced statistics, had a career in financial services, so been surrounded by numbers for a period of time. So started to made sense of the numbers early on, and did some initial reading. And what became very clear very early on, is that there was already a disconnect as early as January and February between the way in which this novel virus was being portrayed in the media and the underlying reality. We can see now, looking back at the early propaganda coming out of China through those images, those striking images, that all was not what it seems. But when we actually look at some of the early papers that come out from China, and I tried to find the original paper that's really spiked my curiosity. I couldn't find it in times of this. I've sent it to my team to try and find. But there was a paper that basically analyzed the early mortality data coming out of China around COVID. And what struck me early on was that the average age of mortality was in excess of 80 years old. And the analysis of comorbidity showed a very high a much increased risk of mortality if you've got 4 or 5 major other comorbidities. So when I saw that data, I thought, well, this is interesting. It appears to be a very much age-graduated virus that is particularly risky. Marilyn, if you have got a picture of, if you have got that paper, please do send it over. It's a relic that we need to celebrate. The data showed that age-graduated risk profile very early on. And of course, things at that stage were still on a small scale, but it gave us an early indication of where the risk really lied. And that early indication of risk, really, when you look at the aggregate data over the course of the last 2 years, hasn't really changed. This has always been a much higher risk condition to those who are already seriously sick and those who are elderly. But what a journey we went on from there, because we've been through a real bombardment of fear and just this assault on our senses, almost a daily stock tick of cases, deaths, hospitalizations throughout the period. And some of the footage that we were seeing of people, this story, how many times did you hear in the last 2 years the phrase bodies piled high? It's just ludicrous. It's insane. Mass graves. Yet when you'd actually go and investigate these mass graves, they were already mass graves. They were used as mass graves all the time because of limited space for the bodies. There were just so many disconnects over the course of the whole foray of the last 2 years. It's unbelievable. It's really unbelievable when you go back, when you actually go back and put yourself in the frame of how it all began and those initial stories. But in terms of my story in entering into a critical set of thinking around this, that initial paper that came out of China was number one. Then the Diamond Princess cruise data, and then the fact that my wife and I were flying to Thailand, which is, it's not China, but it's a neighboring nation relatively. And I wanted to be sure that we weren't flying into a danger zone for, recently married couple. And that initial paper gave me very, very clear confidence. And it felt like it kind of matches what you would see with a different type of respiratory flu. We'd already seen SARS. A friend of mine contracted SARS-1 when that came around. And, it was a bad bout of flu-like symptoms for a few days, and he recovered fine. So I'd seen firsthand SARS and thought, well, it seems like it's very, very, very similar. It seems like it's a very, very similar condition. Now, of course, it is very different to SARS-1, and we're not going to get necessarily into the scientific conversation tonight. It is a different virus, and it has different properties, and it behaves in different ways. But nonetheless, it's still a human coronavirus. And what has shocked me throughout the entire period is almost like they've treated it as a novel virus, yes, but they've almost treated it as a completely new virus, in the sense that any virus that's gone before it, any respiratory virus that's gone before it, any human coronavirus that's gone before it, gives us no clues, no clues of what to expect. It's just nuts. I just don't get it. Like I say, I'm not a scientist. I'm reasonably intelligent. I have a decent IQ. I've lived a bit, and I read a lot. And it just seemed nonsensical to me that this entire time it was treated as this new threat without any reference to prior understanding. I just couldn't get my head around it. Nonetheless, we went on our honeymoon, had a blissful time. But even then, as early as February 2020, I remember getting to the airport, London Heathrow, and the signage had started to appear, wash your hands, and the graphic imagery of how to wash one's hands, step by step. I mean, who actually reads a 10-step guide to washing your hands? This is how we began to be treated. I've talked about this paternalistic relationship between the state and its citizens. Literally a 10-step process to wash your hands. They even developed a song, didn't they, if you remember, about how long you sing the song, and it's going to give you the amount of time you need to wash your hands for. Just ludicrous stuff. But even back then, February 2020, I remember seeing the posters on the wall everywhere. Wash your hands, stay safe. People had started wearing masks voluntarily in the airport. This is long before they were mandated, long before. In fact, it was during the phase where the scientific consensus was that masks are useless and they're not going to help you at that time. And even at that point, and I probably, I mentioned the fact that we got deplatformed after 5 million views of the Pandemic podcast. I'll touch on that as we go through. But the fact that I've mentioned masks and said negative things about masks already probably threatens this particular episode. And we can't get struck off now because we're launching a new podcast on Monday. So I can't get deplatformed again. That would be ludicrous timing, having built up a reasonable audience. So I better be careful what I talk about in this recap, this epilogue, this final episode of the Pandemic podcast. So yes, I even read, and again, what a surprise. The Google machine makes it very hard to find some of those initial articles. I struggled. I wanted to find some of these initial articles for tonight's broadcast. So the original papers coming out of China, I couldn't find again. The original papers that I read on the use of mask wearing, because I became curious then. You can imagine what it's like for my wife, Lizzie. We're sat there at the airport, about to go on a honeymoon. I'm there on my phone reading about the science of masks because people, were wearing these masks in the airport. I'm thinking, why are people wearing masks? Is there any point? This is odd. And I'm not just talking about the people who normally wear masks culturally. There was just people wearing masks. I was like, this is odd. There wasn't, because there was no warning for there was the clear messaging at that point were that they weren't of any use. And actually, all of the reading I did, sat there for the multiple hours that I was at the airport, reinforced that point. There was very little evidence in the use of masks against this type of virus. And I found a fascinating article written by, I think, the Civil Aviation Authority about how unnecessary it was to wear masks on a plane. And it talked about how viruses transmit. It talked about colds and flus and influenzas. And in the context of COVID-19, it basically identified that there was like one seat on the plane or something where there was like a marginally increased risk of catching a cold or any other virus on the basis of the flu, the volume of traffic, but it was like marginal. It was a fantastic article, and of course you can't find it now. Google has buried it in the history of time. But that was the beginning of my curiosity. But then as I was on holiday on our honeymoon, some of the behaviors started showing up that we've become too overly familiar with now. The excess hand washing I mentioned. Already in Thailand, they were using boatloads of sanitizer. And I remember sitting at breakfast one day, and one of the hotel team, she would wash her hand after speaking or dealing with every single customer. So she would bring out her little hand sanitizer and she would sanitize her hand. And I asked her, I said, do you have any skin left on your hands? And she's like, oh, they're really sore, actually. I'm like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And she talked about her worries and fears, and that she'd been told that she had to do it, and it was to keep her safe. Now, of course, again, in terms of evidence, formites, the transmission of this type of virus on surfaces has pretty much been invalidated. Yet still, we see like sanitizer everywhere. But evidence, if you follow the Pandemic podcast for 500 plus episodes, you know that none of this evidence actually matters anymore. But I started to see the behaviors unfolding. The news stories started ramping up. This was in late February. And quite literally, by the time we got back from our honeymoon, prospect of lockdown was beginning to be unfolding. We saw what was happening in Lombardy. And again, I even remember reading about Lombardy. I thought, what's so unique about Lombardy? What was so unique about Lombardy? Well, you look into it, the air quality, you look at their history, their flu seasons, they suffer brutally every flu season. They obviously are in a position whereby they are more likely, more prone to experience adverse overall experiences when it comes to respiratory viruses. The conditions are set. But no one was asking those questions. To me, and again, I'm just a regular citizen who has a questioning mind. I'm deeply curious. And I was just asking questions. And I tried to find as well the 20 questions that I originally posted on social media, because the world has started to go crazy around me. And I wrote these 20 questions, just questions. And I posted them on social media. And this is when like the fear bubble had just started to really expand. And they were sensible questions. I will find them, because I look back, I found them recently. There were some in there that were ill-informed. I will give you that. They since I would have asked different questions, but there was the seed of thought you could see at least. And of course, now spent the 2 years studying the darn thing, I'm much better informed to ask those types of questions. But nonetheless, the majority of those questions were super relevant and still are today. And I was just shot down in pieces. I'd never experienced anything like it on social media. Seriously, just posted questions. And, I'd created other podcasts before. I created a podcast called The Unstoppable Podcast, which you can still find on our YouTube channel, which was really looking at human performance and business and all this type of stuff, entrepreneurship. So people knew that I had a sensible voice, or at least, had begun to develop one after my early years, from my days at university, where I was a lot less sensible. And I got shot down for asking these questions on social media. And that was the beginning of that toxic situation whereby the world's perception had just switched into this fear mode, and that there was questioning was just not acceptable. And I got slammed. And that shut a door for me at that time, because as early as March, I was really starting to ask big questions, and a lot of it didn't make sense. And then literally within a week of getting back to Britain from our honeymoon, boom, there it was, lockdown, Boris on the television. I remember Lizzie and I sat there watching the broadcast thinking, what on earth is happening? What is this all about? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. So I'm going to pull up my little slideshow now to help us go down this trip of memory lane. Because what I did then was start this brand new project. I'd started a brand called Elevate Media. And my vision at the time was to provide an antidote to some of the challenges that our world is facing by bringing together some of the world's most inspiring thought leaders and subject matter experts to explore how we can address the world's most pressing issues and help to co-create a better future. That was the mind my brain was already in going into 2020. I'd been through some really transformative experiences in the decade that preceded it, and I really wanted to start moving down a pathway of change. But if you watch some of my early videos, which I'll talk about in a minute, from 2020, I was green around the ears. I was very much a novice at using broadcast software like this, even though I'd had a podcast before this. My tone of voice, I didn't have the same certainty. It's just, I've developed personally so much as an individual, as a leader, as a human being. I believe over the last 2 years, it's been one of the most transformative personal experiences that one has gone through what I'm sharing right now. But my mind was already in the place of creating transformational experiences. So I wanted to do something to help make a difference to people who had gone slammed into lockdowns and had their lives disrupted. Now, I made the assumption that everyone was like me and wanted to make good, productive use of their time that they suddenly had available, and that they would take the time to actually invest in themselves and actually develop themselves and use this time to reflect, because, so many people were slammed into paid leave, furlough. I wasn't. I was self-employed. I didn't qualify for any of that. So I was just like, I'm going to do something meaningful with my time. And I expected others were going to do the same. No, there was a lot more Netflix and chill than there was people investing their time. But I launched this project called Elevate Live, which precedes what we're about to start now. And I called it Ideas That Can Change the World. And we put together this program of educational, inspirational content that was really looking at how we navigate that unique time. And I wanted to help people stay uplifted, motivated, engaged, positive, because it was a challenging time. I forecast how difficult it would be for people. I could imagine already, the way my mind works is I start to see the picture of things unfold before they've unfolded. And I could see the stress, struggle, and strife that people would go through during this time. And that's from the policy, let alone people's fear of the virus, which was palpable. So I launched this project. I went live every day for 3 to 5 times a day for 45 days straight during the first lockdown. I said I was going to keep going as long as we're in lockdown. Now, I started the project thinking, cool. This is going to be a 2 weeks to flatten the curve, whatever it was back then. Was it 2 weeks, 3 weeks? I don't know. What was the promise? I don't remember now. Was it 2 weeks to flatten the curve? You have to remind me in the comments. I thought, okay, I can handle this for 2 weeks. I can do 2 or 3 videos or 4 or 5 videos a day for 2 weeks. I can do that. That's all right. So we set up this platform. We're going to do self-help videos, well-being, spirituality, money, discovering how to manage and grow your money business, how to start your own business and create your own economy. Live classes. We did everything from fitness to yoga, breathwork, meditation. We put on this whole festival of ideas. I just got on with it and thought, right, 2 weeks, hardcore. Let's help people get through this. And all of these videos are still available, but we're going to put them inside the We Are Elevate platform, the Elevate network. And there were some amazing interviews. My skills as an interviewer have come on a long way, but the conversations during that time, some of them were so profound, life-changingly profound. And I was getting a lot of benefit from that. I was soaking up these powerful conversations with some really, really, really transformative, some really great minds. And it was a goal to help people to get through the time. And we ended up reaching over 100,000 people during that project. But it went on for a lot longer than 2 weeks. 45 days straight we went on for. 85 different people featured on that as speakers or trainers, personal trainers, yoga experts, everything. We just an amazing time. And, it just did this just as a way to contribute and add value. But during the course of that project, increasingly in my spare time, I was reading more and more and more. And my poor wife, Lizzie, every day during our 1 hour walk, and I wasn't fully in the conformist zone. I'm never fully in the conformist zone, no matter what I'm doing. But we were being relatively following the guidelines at that point. And to be quite frank, I was working like 12-hour days plus to put this project on. So I didn't really have much time to rebel anyway. But we'd go on these 1 hour walks, and Lizzie's poor ears just had to put up with me ranting the entire time about how wrong these lockdowns were, how it made no sense, how the data and the science weren't adding up. And then I got the Public Health England, and I tried to find that for this episode tonight, because again, if you read those Public Health England guidelines from April 2020, about how they were going to diagnose and categorize cases of COVID and deaths from COVID, immediately after reading that document, I thought, this is a nightmare. This is going to be an absolute nightmare. We're never, ever, ever going to know the true burden of COVID-19. We'll never, ever know. It's going to be an accounting nightmare because the protocols were ludicrous. There was no established case definition. There was no established diagnostic process. And anything that came into the hospitals or healthcare settings that demonstrated signs basically of a cold or flu would be categorized as COVID-19. And this was before we got well into mass testing. This preceded the testing regimen. This was just like, you sneezed, you coughed, you're a COVID fatality. It was insane. And I challenge you to read that document and think, yeah, that makes sense. It just does not make sense. So every day I was reading more and more, and it got worse and worse and worse. I'd had my little dip into social media. I had another little post and got absolutely annihilated again. So I went back into my cave and continued on with this Elevate Live project, doing my bit to help elevate humanity, doing my bit to help people get along. And I said I would keep going until lockdown ended, and the thing just never ended. This whole thing just never ended, and it felt like it never did end until 2 years later. But I had to draw a line. I said, I can't keep going. I said I'd keep going until the end of restrictions. Well, goodness me, I couldn't have kept up at 3 to 4 times a day. But those of you who have been a fan of the podcast, who followed us along, there were, for the majority of the time that we were broadcasting, I was doing daily broadcasts every single day. People could tap in at 5 o'clock every night, see my face here on social media, trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. And it began, as I'll talk about in a minute, just asking sensible questions. I'll talk to you about how it evolved. But I did this Elevate Live project, and I ended up aborting it because I couldn't face it any longer. I couldn't face it. I couldn't face what was happening in the world and not find a way to speak out. But having been burned a few times on social media, I just didn't feel confident. I didn't have the courage to speak out. And it took several months later. When I finally bit the bullet and recorded this video where I called it, I've been a coward, but I'm no longer willing to stay silent, on the 14th of August, 2020, something like 10 a.m. in the morning. I'd been pacing around outside thinking, what am I going to do? But I had this tap on the shoulder moment. It really did feel like a profound spiritual intervention. It felt like a tap on the shoulder where I had this message inside me that said, if you don't step up and lead now, Dan, when in your life are you ever going to step up and lead? And it felt like a call to arms and a call to action. It felt like something beyond me was calling me to lead, because there'd been many times before me in my life where I'd had opportunities to lead, but I'd buckled under my own fears, my own self-doubt. So I had this kind of profound moment. And then there was this second message that followed that said, you're going to face a ton of challenges, but those challenges are all put forward in front of you in order to grow as a leader. And I was like, okay, wherever this message is coming from, even if it's just coming from the insides of my head, whether you want to take a profound definition or not, I accepted that call. And the next morning is when I recorded this video. And given how I'd worked my ass off for 45 days, building Elevate Live, trying to go viral, trying to get these profound conversations out into the world, and really struggling. Having moments of pressing the button on this live recording, like I'd never seen anything like it. The viewer numbers just started chunking up. And by the end of like the next 24 hours or something, it had gone over 300,000 views. It had been shared 6,000 times or something. And it was insane. I just had to get it off my chest. I'd seen these images of these children in perspex boxes. I thought, I'm not going to have children growing up in the world where they're being put in boxes for this thing, which is a very limited risk to them. So that was it. It was enough is enough moment, line in the sand. That's it. So I hit this video, 20 minutes long, said my piece, and whatever I said in that video, and I must go back and watch it again, whatever I said in that video obviously struck a chord, and I vocalized what other people were thinking. And funny enough, in approaching that video, there were a couple of people in my mind who I respect deeply that I thought would say to me, Dan, what are you doing? Stay out of this, stay in your lane, stay on the business, keep doing the Elevate thing, don't get political. And these were going around in my voice, this inner voice, like it was my fear showing up. And one of those people, interestingly, that I imagined saying that to me was, you can see him in the comments here, Rob Moore. But he said, good on you for speaking your truth, Dan. Watch the whole video, very proud of you. Now, Rob Moore is a very busy entrepreneur, very successful entrepreneur. I know he's busy, but he wrote the book called Life Leverage. So he also has some time on his hands, I do hope. But I imagine what Rob would say. And I imagine what my dear friend Alan would say. Both of them commented on my videos. And another gentleman, James Lavers, all friends of mine, very successful entrepreneurs in their own right. I imagine what they would say about me doing this video. But I did it anyway. And all three of them have become really great supporters of the work. So it goes to show, when our inner voice, when it holds us back in that way, we have to stand guard at those fears, and we have to claim our sovereignty. And I truly felt that was a step into my own sovereignty at that time. But obviously, having done a video like that, I thought, how do I follow that? And that was in August. But either way, I continued to research and decided to become an active participant in change. So on the left-hand side, you'll see me at a protest in Bristol, where I had the opportunity to speak to, at that time, a small crowd of around 100 people in the beautiful sunshine, as we began the fight for freedom, as we began to push back and not just be a silent witness, not just watching what was happening in the world, but actually embarking upon actively seeking to try and change it. Most of you have never seen me in real life. I'm actually about 6'1". You just see my face. The amount of times I've been to a protest and people say, you're much taller than I thought. It's funny, isn't it? You just see the upper part of me on here. But there's a photo on the right-hand side. I think it was August or September 2020 in London, Trafalgar Square. I was wearing my Free Humanity t-shirt. I recognize it. Where I spoke from Trafalgar Square in front of 50, 60,000 people. Another one of those times where the media said, hundreds of people gather. Ludicrous. Trafalgar Square has a known capacity. It was packed to the seams. It was packed down the side roads. But that was the day where Dr. Heike Schoening had flown over from Germany, was speaking from the stage, and we were swarmed by these heavy-duty police officers who came and shut down the sound system and aggressively dispersed the crowds. It was a dark day. It was a dark day that day. It plagued me that day. Dr. Heike Schoening was arrested. I'd been showing him around London in the morning. I felt personally responsible for his well-being. And I ended up staying in London that night as long as I could to try and get him out of his stay in prison, being a visit, being a visit to the country. I thought, what an experience this is for you as a guest of the United Kingdom, having been heavily handed arrested by this mob. What a crazy day. And I went home that night, traveled back to Bristol late, and I just couldn't sleep. I thought it was a really dark day. It was one of the darkest days I'd witnessed. I'd never seen police brutality like it. I saw an old lady trampled. I saw people getting hit. It was quite deeply profound. And interestingly, that day, my dear friend Jo Rogers, who was also in the crowd that day, that was the day that she decided to start Lawyers for Liberty. And our paths have crossed many times, and so has and her dear father, John, Dr. John Rogers, who's also been on the podcast, have become dear friends of mine. And it was just a fortuitous moment that we were both uniquely on our own experience that day, but so much good has come from that day. But it gave me the resolve to want to go the distance, to really make a difference from those early stages of entering into activism for the first time in my life. I'd never been to a protest before that. There was plenty I'd debated and argued. There's plenty I would have stood against if I'd had the courage. But 2020 was the year that I had the courage to finally stand up and become an active participant in change. And I've been part of the protest movement ever since. And I've been using my voice to try and affect change ever since. And I will continue to do so for the rest of my life now. That is it. You cannot take that out of me now. I'm an activist. I'm here for the duration. So whilst this may be the end of the pandemic podcast, it's the beginning of something new, which I'll tell you about shortly. But then I went on to, having had that video experience, went viral, had my moment, which was bizarre because I'd go to the protest and everyone was like, oh, are you that guy from the internet? I'm like, maybe, I don't know, maybe. But then I launched the Pandemic Podcast in October 2020. We began with a simple aim to educate, empower, inform, and inspire. We did daily live news, guest interviews, in-field reporting, opinion pieces. And at the beginning, it was all really about the science and the data. I would get the latest papers as they come up. As I'd read them, I'd digest them. And I would simply, for those of you who've been here since the beginning, you remember I'd have like books of notes. And I'd be saying on the screen, just excuse me as I look at my notes, just reading through all this data and evidence that I'd been reviewing. And then bringing in the interviews and all the different conversations with doctors, scientists, and different perspectives, really trying to assess and make sense of the situation, really asking the questions that most seemed unwilling to ask. And I wanted to bring a set of principles that I was not observing in the mainstream media. One, being focused on the truth. This means not only obtaining and verifying the facts, but putting those facts into context. That was an aim of mine with the Pandemic Podcast. Independent, to be free from financial and political conflicts of interest. We accepted donations, and thank you to everyone that supported us. Thank you so much, because it's enabled me to do this for 2 years. I've had to leave my previous business behind to do this, and it's not been easy. It's not been easy, but it's just enabled me to keep going. So I want to thank every one of you that's not only supported the podcast by watching it, sharing it, engaging. Those of you who have taken a step and donated, unbelievable, your support, how much that means to me. Number 3, fair and impartial, presenting multiple sides of any issue without political bias. Okay, I haven't done so well on this one. What began as a fair and impartial broadcast, the sheer weight of the narrative in the media, the mainstream narrative, meant that there had to be a counterbalance. And the Pandemic Podcast played a role in providing that counterbalance. It's still focused on the truth, obtaining and verifying facts, but it presented an alternative to the mainstream narrative. But I still tried to do so without bias. And even till today, I get people saying, I don't get you, Dan. Are you, what side of the political spectrum are you on? Because I can resonate with the left and the right and everything in between. I tried to bring some sort of radical centrism to this so that I can actually resonate with more people. And not polarized based upon politics. And then lastly, and most importantly, to serve humanity, a commitment to use the content and the stories to impact the world in a positive way rather than causing harm. And even when I was addressing difficult subject matter, I'd always try and leave people feeling empowered and leave people feeling like there's hope. And I'll continue to do that to today. Lastly, accountable, acknowledging and correcting my errors or remedying unfair coverage of an issue. There's been multiple times where I've gone on record to correct my own errors. There's been multiple times that I've come and said the situation has changed. There's new data. And that's what scientific thinking is about. That's what critical thinking is about. It's constantly reassessing your own biases, your own evidence. We need to do more of that. But that's what we sought to do with the Pandemic podcast. Impact-wise, we launched on the 22nd of October 2020, and we broadcast right through to today, our very final episode of the Pandemic podcast, the 8th of April 2022. We've had somewhere between 10 and 15 million views, maybe more. It's difficult to account because, as I mentioned, our Pandemic podcast YouTube channel got taken down after 5 million views. We've had things censored from Facebook. We've had things taken down from Twitter. Some things just have terrible analytics, but we've well and truly gone past 10 million views, and it's probably past 15 million now, with viewers in over 100 countries around the world. Even though we've been reporting primarily on what's happening in the United Kingdom, global audience following our content. It's been truly marvelous to engage. Over 400 episodes, maybe 500, probably 500 again for the same problems. We'd have to go back and manually count them all. I'm not sure it's good use of time in the context of the challenges we face today, but maybe one day out of curiosity, if someone's bored, you might come and let us know how many episodes we've done, but certainly over 400, probably over 500. Just an enormous amount of content and conversations, really, again, trying to make sense of the world at a time where the world made no sense. Then, those of you who are not familiar, we launched Question Everything, a sub-brand of Elevate. And we ran our first ever physical event. We did the Lockdown Summit in London on the 17th of July, 2021. We had speakers from all over the world. It was the first summit to evaluate the global response to COVID-19 and propose alternative solutions. I just wonder how important that content will be, how important it will become in the wake of COVID-19, because we've documented so much. And on the podcast, I've done it in my own unique style. But with Question Everything, we brought together some really credible experts and delivered it in an engaging but academic format, really breaking down what has gone before us. Just curious how important that content may be as we go into the public inquiry. And we still have plans to Question Everything. I think it's a wonderful brand, and I think it's really important that we do continue to question everything. And whilst we move to look at the Elevate podcast beyond the Pandemic podcast, looking at solutions, it's important that we still find a way to question everything. So watch this space. But it leads me to where we are today. And in all the challenges that we've witnessed in the last couple of years, there's one thing that stood out for me, is that we have a great opportunity to really create change in the world in the wake of COVID-19. And many people have been waiting throughout the pandemic for someone else to make them feel safe, to make them feel comfortable or secure out of their own fears. People look to others to lead. But my message throughout this has been, it's down to us to be the leaders, each one of us, to be the change we want to see. It's up to us to educate, empower, inform, and inspire. And that is exactly what we seek to do with the Elevate brand, which we're launching our brand new show on Monday. Don't worry, this isn't turning into a sales pitch. I'm actually not going to talk very much about Elevate tonight. I want to just tease you a little bit, because it's time to start talking about change. It's time to, yes, continue to educate and inform, but it's time to become empowered. It's time to transform ourselves and begin to transform the world around us and inspire change. And that is our goal with the Elevate podcast, which is going live on Monday with our very first episode, where I'll introduce in more depth the scope of the vision of what we're trying to bring with Elevate, as we bring the Elevate brand back to back to where it all began, from where it was in March 2020 with Elevate Live, seeking to make a difference in the world. It's now come full circle, and it's time to transform ourselves. It's time to transform our own and elevate our own consciousness and find a way to make a difference in the world around us. Now, we're still working on the vision and the mission statement, but this is the original statement that I came up with in March 2020 for Elevate Live. Our vision is to create a global movement of empowered citizens who seek to co-create a better future for humankind and the world we live in. I feel that that's a strong statement to make even today, and it couldn't be more true today, having been through what we've been through over the last 2 years. And I invite you to be part of that movement of empowered citizens who together will find a way to transcend and avoid this path of self-destruction that we seem to be on, and instead choose a path of self-determination in order to determine how we will create our destiny in the wake of everything that's unfolded in the last 2 years. And we want to continue to bring together some of the most inspiring thought leaders, creating thought-provoking content that seeks to address the world's most pressing issues and becoming a catalyst for change. That's really where my heart is at in the wake of what's happened. We still need to resist. We still need to use activism. In fact, there's plenty to challenge. The Human Rights Bill, got work to do on the public inquiry, the police bill, the online safety bill in the United Kingdom, all of these things. Activism and resistance is always going to be part of the path to change. But if we stay in that path, if we stay on that journey without embracing a way to reimagine and rebuild and envision the future, then we will get stuck in fighting the old and never building the new. So Elevate seeks to build that bridge from the old to the new and encourage you to join us on that movement as we begin to create a better tomorrow. And I hope you will join us on Monday for our very first episode of the Elevate podcast, as we transition from this very last episode today of the Pandemic podcast into transitioning into a new world, a new dawn, and beginning to look at how we can create a better tomorrow. So I'm as excited as I was, if not more excited than I was at the beginning of 2020, seeing the opportunity to see this transformative decade. And what's happened over the last 2 years has really created the conditions for change. There are millions of us around the world who followed along the lines of the conversations that we've been having here on the Pandemic podcast. It is my aspiration that we will find our way into the minds and hearts of all of those that have fought hard over the last 2 years for our freedoms, our rights, our liberties. I hope they will find their way to the Elevate movement, where together around the world, we will find a way to strengthen our freedoms, to unite in peace and love, and find a way to co-create a better world, not only for ourselves, but for generations to come. Because now, as a father with a 7-month-old son, I want to make sure that he grows up in a world where he has more freedoms, more rights, and more opportunities than I had. And right now, those freedoms, those rights, and those opportunities are under threat. So it's down to us to lead change in this world. It is down to us to be the change we want to see. And I invite you on that journey. I really do hope to see you on our inaugural episode on Monday of the Elevate podcast, as we start to shift the direction, shift the conversation into how we can create change in the world around us. Because if we're waiting for someone else to lead change, it may never come. It's on our shoulders, and the power is in our hands to make the difference in the world that we wish to see. And I truly believe in each one of us has the power and the capability to make change, and we all have gifts to bring to the world. And it's my dream that we can, through Elevate, help everyone find that gift inside them, that power that's always been inside them, and that they rise up and become the leaders that they were born to be in order to change the world around us. So I'm going to leave you on that note of excitement, I hope. I'm quite emotional, actually, saying goodbye to the Pandemic podcast. It's been such a part of my life for the last 2 years, even before the podcast existed. I'm deeply grateful for the experiences that I've had, even through these challenging times. I want to thank every one of our audience, all 15 million views. I don't think we've reached 15 million people. I think several 100,000 people have watched our content on multiple times. Very thankful for our loyal fans of the show. Some of you have been there right from the beginning. You know, when I go to the protests, it's such an honor to meet people face to face that I've had the opportunity of reaching through the content. It really is a true honor. I'm so grateful that I've had such strong support from so many like-minded people, through engaging in the content, through sharing, through donating. Like I said, it's just enabled us to do what we've done. I want to thank every single one of the people who have volunteered as part of my team over the last 2 years. We started with just a handful of us. We expanded to just over 30 of us at one time. It was actually too many people. It became disorganized chaos, but everyone had a role to play. And to my current team that I've now had the privilege of employing, and at least on a freelance basis at this moment in time, as we start to build the foundations for change. I'm so grateful that I have such dedicated team members working behind the scenes with me to enable us to do what we do here on the show, but also now within the Elevate network, our private community. It's really created the foundation for change, and I just hope what we've done over the last couple of years has served as a point of inspiration for you. I hope it's helped you find meaning and sense in the world at a time where things just don't make sense and things lack meaning. And I hope that we'll continue to you'll stay connected to what we're doing through the Elevate podcast, which is launching on Monday. And I do hope that you'll join us inside of our private community, our movement, our Elevate network, where you can continue the conversation. And I know that we are embracing the summer of freedom this summer. The summer of freedom. This summer is the summer of freedom. And we will have plenty of opportunities to meet face to face as we get out and start to create a wave and a ripple of change, a ripple that becomes a wave as we embrace a bright future. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for being with us this entire journey in this final episode of the Pandemic Podcast. It really is a defining moment, but I'm so excited for this transition. Just in the tick of the clock from 2019 to 2020, we embarked upon a new decade, a decade of transformation, a simple change of the logo and a change of the brand and a change of focus will enable us now to focus on how we can create change, how we can find solutions, how we can build strong communities. It's in our hands. Change is in our hands. Let this be the most exciting time to be alive. This is the most exciting time to be alive. We're going to go through our challenges, but as that message that was given to me at the very beginning, those challenges are here to serve us. Those challenges are here to make us grow. And as we grow, we can become stronger leaders and carving a path of change that leads us to a brighter future, a better tomorrow through the summer of freedom and beyond. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please do hit the share button. My extensive gratitude to each one of you. I'm blessed to have had so many amazing people along the ride with me here. And I hope that may continue through our next venture through the Elevate podcast. Good night. Peace and love to you. Have a wonderful weekend. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday for the very first episode of our new chapter on the Elevate podcast.